And welcome to episode 12 of the Brood Sages, Stormbound players with a head for the game. I am Freeloader, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Sabaiku and Arthas. Sabaiku, how's it going tonight?
Fantastic.
And Arthas, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Well, we are the Brood Sages, and as a reminder, you can always contact us at Brood Sages on Twitter. Or for all of you who used to play Street Fighter on your Tiger Electronics handheld, our email address is thebroodsages@gmail.com. All right, guys. So I know we should probably address the elephant in the room. A couple of weeks ago, we announced that we were going to a every other week schedule, and that lasted all of 1 week, and we all kind of missed it to the point that we're back now to a weekly.
Yeah, we experienced some withdrawal symptoms.
Severe. So now we're back, and as part of that, we started getting some feedback, really positive feedback about the meta report and its impact on some of our listeners. But there were some questions around things like, hey, how do I use this? And like, I understand these archetypes kind of in theory, but how do they play out, kind of a thing. So what we're going to do today, this is not as hashed out perhaps as some of our other episodes, but we're going to try to just have a conversation about some of the top decks in the game right now, as you can find them on the meta report, and try to show you the kinds of details and inferences you can make about what's going on from looking at those charts. Okay, so for starters, we have two different ways of ranking the decks. We can rank them by most played, or we can rank them by what we think are the strongest. Now, Arthas, when I'm looking at the decks that are strongest, and I start to see, for instance, the way they are this month, that the strongest two decks are also two of the most played decks, what inference can I start making about how accurate perhaps the meta is in terms of, like, is it stable? Has it been figured out? Or do you think it's still going to change a lot? That kind of thing.
Well, it seems that people have figured out, at least for the strongest archetypes, that is the kind of like playstyle and deck that they would want to be playing and investing recently. I mean, showing that like a lot of people are playing both Winter Control and Ironclad midrange, while also those two being the most powerful. I think it's a pretty nice indication that it's pretty accurate in terms of like how strong these archetypes are because they're so popular and people are really using and investing their time into it.
And Sabaiku, when I look at, say, two decks like, for example, Ironclad Rush and Swarm Rush, which the meta report suggests are about the same power level, but then I look at frequency and I see they're vastly different. What kind of inference can I start making about that?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to tackle this problem. The first one, you can look at the Ironclad Rush and say, people just don't understand how strong it is, and that's why they don't play it. That's definitely one way to look at it. Although looking at our power scores, it's pretty solidly middle of tier 2. It's not so strong that you're really going to go out of your way to play it unless you already have those cards at a high level. And I think that brings up the second way to look at it, which is just Ironclad Rush is a lot more expensive to play if you don't already have high level linked golems or destructo bots or Hearthguards. Maybe you want to run Hearthguards as a finisher, but that's another epic you have to level up. It's an expensive one to invest your resources in, and if it's not clearly one of the most powerful decks in the game, maybe you don't want to put that kind of resource allocation toward it. Whereas Swarm Rush is one of the less expensive decks to make. There's a lot of commons you can put into this, like Doppelbox and Dreadfawns. Cut out the Dreadfawns. I don't want Reckless to get mad at me. But a lot of the cards that are going to go into this are commons, are easier to level up, and more importantly, Swarm Rush has been stronger for longer. So if you are an established player, you probably already have these cards at a fairly high level to begin with, and that lets you continue to use the cards that you have played. Even though it's not necessarily the strongest deck, it'll still win you games.
Yeah, one of the decks that I find most interesting when I'm looking at the donut chart here, the frequency score, is the fact that Shadowfen Rush, which we believe to be the strongest by a decent margin rush deck in the game, is also pretty much tied for Winterpact Rush as the least played rush deck in the game. I think
I think people just don't understand how good it is. If nothing else today, we want to point out Shadowfen Rush is the way to go.
It is nuts, but I think it lends a lot
No, don't play it with nuts.
No. Do not play with Cordia.
You could though. You could.
Yeah, you could. You could play it with that's for sure. But Cordia is better. But I think it lends a lot of credence to what you're saying, that there's a certain player base that has already invested so much of their resources into leveling up a deck, and that deck happens to be a Swarm Rush deck because it was so good for so long that they really don't have the ability to change their deck to suit a meta. This is no longer the overpowering Swarm Rush deck that Brzoza admitted Sheepyard had to nerf to or well, indirectly nerf by buffing all these controlled cards like Void Surges, right? It's not the same deck anymore. This is a different meta, and that deck doesn't overpower everything. But it's still being played at such a high level, I think, because, to a certain extent, this game does kind of lock you in. If you've put all your resources into a deck, that's the deck you've got.
It takes either a lot of time or a lot of money to just be able to pivot decks like that. Arthas, you're probably the best equipped to tell us how much money it takes to pivot.
Oh boy, don't remind me of my irresponsible spendings. But I mean, it's also a bit different because for people who have invested on things like the overpowered Swarm Rush from before, I mean, people were doing so in a different environment as now. So like back then, like back when Paladins were still in charge of Stormbound and its changes, like any changes you find are usually takes like several months, and sometimes those changes are like they don't even matter, right? So it's much easier for people to like think, oh, okay, like Swarm Rush is like so good, and like changes aren't being made that frequently. It's a very safe bet to invest a lot on Swarm Rush right now because that's what the trend is. But recently, now that Sheepyard is doing these monthly balance changes, and they're pretty significant changes to it, that it people have to like recollect like their mindset in terms of like what kind of cards and resources they want to put their time onto, and that definitely affected like someone like me. I mean, I still have 1,000 plus fusion stones, but like I don't know what to use them on because like oh, like I can easily max my link golems because I know they're really strong right now, but like man, they could get nerfed anytime soon. Something like that kind of scares me, and I know some people have that kind of paranoia as well. But it's definitely a different
Right.
kind of like environment of to be investing in because you want to be more well-rounded, right?
It's funny that you don't want to invest your resources in a card because it's strong, because you think it's going to get changed, which
Yeah.
but it's strong. Like invest your resources in it and hope that it works out. There's no good answer there, right? Because no matter which way you go, either you don't invest your resources, then you're not happy that you're not playing something new, or you do invest your resources and you always constantly fear, was that the right bucket? I have a limited amount of resources. Was that the right place to put it?
Well, okay. Just a little disclaimer. I am in a little bit of a different position compared to like other people. I mean, I've been Diamond 1 for I don't know how long anymore, but I don't have any like sort of problem getting there. And because that's just the highest you can really get in the game, like I don't really have an incentive to go even more like even stronger than I already am right now, because it's not like it does too much for me, but there is a little more risk. That's just in my position. I don't want to sound arrogant
yeah,
or
but
anything,
no,
but
but it's not just an arrogance thing, right? Like there's a secondary problem to it. You're playing at such a high level that a modest, let's say you haven't put a lot of resources in Ironclad. I don't know if that's true or not, but let's just say for an argument's sake that you haven't. Well, then when you decide suddenly you want to try to make Diamond 1 with Ironclad, it's not just, well, I put 100 to level this up to level 3 and 100 gold to put that one to level 3 And this last one, there you go, 300 gold in with some fusion stones, and now I've leveled up my. No, 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 no. You're talking about significant fusion stone and gold investments in that deck in order for you to be competitive at Diamond 1 with it, right?
Yeah. It's not like leveling up a card to level 3 and be like, okay, that's really good. No, I gotta bring it to like 4 or like most of the time 5.
Right.
It's a lot. And it's like there are times when like I don't even need to bring them to 5. Like people have been judging me for not maxing out my Green Protos, my Saber Paws, my Hunter's Vengeance. Like Green Proto's probably not gonna get changed anytime soon. Hunter's Vengeance was recently changed, so that's pretty safe.
Yep.
But like I don't need to max them because I'm already good enough where I am and I am still competitive. I don't really have an incentive to use all of my hoarded up like fusion stones and gold. And also because I am also looking forward to like the new cards because they are, thinking of releasing new cards like frequently. So maybe there is a really good one that I would love to spend like 400 fusion stones on or something like that. So I'm waiting for that day.
Using the exact logic that you were just walking us through, and this is, this was, if you recall, we had a few episodes ago where we had this conversation, but this was the point I was trying to make on it, right? You sit there now and you're like, you look at a card that you already know how good it is, and you're thinking, well, it's pretty strong. Do I want to put investment into it and then have it nerfed or not? My resources are so scarce, it's so hard to replenish them without spending, gobs of money or whatever, that I'm not sure I want to allocate them. They run into that same problem potentially with any new card they put out. If it's borderline strong enough that you are worried that maybe it won't see play or won't be good enough, you won't put the investment in. But if it's clearly strong enough that it's worth the investment, you also start to have anxiety because you're like, well, I don't want to put resources into this, level it up, and a month from now have a balance change, remove all of its strength.
Yeah, I remember. I have a note to add to that. I remember Berzosa mentioned this quite a few times whenever he was releasing cards and or changing cards. Is that they are more hesitant to release very good cards, and I know a lot of people are complaining about the new cards nowadays because they're like very underwhelming. But he said, and it just makes a lot of sense. One of the things they really hate to do is release something like so good that's like to the point where it's like too good, right? And then people invest their resources into it and then they strip them away really quickly. They're not comfortable with doing something.
We call that the
scummy,
Hearthstone effect.
right?
We call that a business model.
That's right. Blizzard's made money off of that model for years. But I do want to.
We're wandering a little bit.
Right.
It's a good conversation, but it's definitely touching on something we've already talked about.
That's okay.
But it's a valid reason, I think, why you start to notice a discrepancy between frequency and power, right? You will see decks that are not that strong, and a lot of times it might just be because that's what you got and you don't really have much else.
Right. And to some effect, as players who've come from a game like Hearthstone, it's actually one of the things that makes Stormbound so endearing is the fact that the meta never really settles and people aren't all jumping onto the next hottest thing because some of them, they are where they are. They make slight movements in that direction. They maybe take the edge off their rush deck and bring them more into the mid-range kind of a thing. And so the meta is just it's always a more fluid thing here because of that. I don't think it ever fully settles out, which I like.
And it helps to create some variability when we put a lot of, say, Ironclad mid-range is one of the most popular decks. We put a lot of different decks into that bucket because they all use the same core set of cards and they all have a similar style of play, but individual card choices can vary across the deck in a lot of other areas, whether you choose to go in a structure direction and play upgrade point in Mia, or if you want to say maybe upgrade point isn't worth it, but I do want to have unstable and fort tonic instead, right? There are different ways to make it, and different cards you can pick that help to make the deck yours, even though there's a lot of other decks that are similar to it.
Right. And actually, why don't we get into that now, right? So let's let's start by talking about Ironclad mid-range, and just as a primer to the people who might not recall what our nomenclature is. So Rush is, an aggressive, all-out, I'm going to beat your face, and then when I'm done doing that, I'm going to beat your face some more. On the far end, we get Control, which is I am going to try to delay and invest value and have a sort of giant swing turn at some point where I convert my value into tempo, but my deck is built in such a way as to deny your tempo. And in between is mid-range. And mid-range will have some elements that look rushy because they tend to be the beatdown when they play against control decks. But they'll also have some elements that look a little bit more controlling. And the reason for that is because they're not as fast as a rush deck. There are turns where you just don't have enough cheap cards in your deck like you do with a rush deck to be able to always perfectly mana fit. And so, mid-range needs to kind of play in the middle of the field. It is usually weak to rush and is usually favored against control. So Arthas, walk us through what are the key cards of an Ironclad mid-range deck?
So, something that's very, very prominent in Ironclad midrange is like anything that buffs your units, especially constructs, because it seems to be very easy to get that kind of value nowadays. Cards like Fortification Tonic, very good card because you have so many structures in the Ironclad faction. Also, something like Upgrade Point and Mia to trigger the upgrade point more than usual. Having a bunch of constructs like Destructobots, Green Prototypes, Link Golems especially, but that's kind of an auto include in like every Ironclad deck. But it is
Every
very,
Ironclad.
very good in mid range because of the buff and the sheer amount of strength that it can have. Yeah, I mean that's really all you need.
Right,
Like some structures like Unstable Fortification Tonic with how incredibly overpowered it is right now. It's like enough to carry yourself.
the buff to Fort Tonic is what put Ironclad mid-range at the top of the heap, right? Like before that, it was a viable deck, but not the tier 1 top. That
Yeah.
Fort Tonic buff has been
Yeah.
very, very good.
Unstable also got a little extra health recently.
Yeah.
That doesn't hurt anything.
No, it does not.
With Fortonics is so strong that even when I prefer to play Ironclad Control because mid range is just gross. Like I like to play Ironclad Control with structures like Siege and True Shot. Mid range
Sure.
doesn't necessarily need True Shot because True Shot is more of a control value oriented card. But me as a control player with my control type deck, I just slap in Fort Tonic there, and I can easily be mid range when I want to. It's so stupid.
But I also agree that part of what makes Ironclad so effective with the Fort Tonic is the fact that it's sitting on the cheapest tower in the game, right? Like
And they
that
also have the
combos
most.
wonderful. Sure. But being able to just expend 4 mana to effectively buff all the units you have on the board is pretty nuts.
Yeah, I mean, 4 mana with simply 3 units. At max level, you get 18 value plus the structure that you put down. It's crazy.
Right. And so right, exactly. And so when you talk about, well, why is it that mid-range decks are favored into control decks? It's like, okay, so you opened with a very strong couple of turns, and then your turn 5 was Green Proto's Unstable Fort Tonic, and you just buffed 4 units. Talk to me about what 5 mana or 6 mana card a control deck is going to play in response to that matters at all.
They're going to need to buff Void Searchers again.
All right, so moving on, let's talk. Sabaiku, walk me through Winter Pack Control. What does a Winter Pack Control deck look like?
Well, if you asked me a month ago, I would have said it looks like Aaron, Gift of the Wise, and pretty much anything else. Doesn't really matter what the other 10 cards are. But I'm definitely seeing this month a lot more of a freeze variation that
Okay.
plays also, Shyvana and freeze effects. Does not include Aaron. Often still has Gift of the Wise, but doesn't necessarily need to. So there's definitely two different distinct decks being played. The Aaron Gift of the Wise deck tends to run Ulf as life gain, sometimes with Underground Springs also. Uh, Tends to run some other sort of board clear spell. If your Aaron is level 4, you will cast 2 spells for free. So you'll add in a Blade Storm or a Needle Blast, or sometimes both. The way that I was running this deck early this month was with extra runners. So with Tigor and Siren of the Seas makes it a much more expensive deck, but those are 2 cards that can be used flexibly for defense or for offense, which is just makes it a lot more fun to play. The freeze style deck we'll talk about in a little bit that plays a very different set of cards, but there's one card that is played in both, and that's Void Surgers.
Void Surgers is played in a lot of not only control but mid-range decks now.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great, we talked about this in the last episode. It is a card that gives you tempo and value, and that's a really good fit for a mid-range deck. But it's also a very good control tool.
It's phenomenal.
It's if Arthas, if you want to talk about the Freeze Winter decks that you've been playing and how strong you think they are compared to the Aaron Gift of the Wise decks.
Well, the Aaron Gifted the Wise decks are definitely stronger than the Freeze Zivana decks, but the Freeze Zivana decks are for sure still really competitive. I mean, I still use it in the top level against people who use like Aaron Gifted the Wise or even Ironclad mid range, because with the new freeze rework, the new icicle burst, Zivana is really really nice. It's really fun and it's so rewarding to use when you have enough experience to use her reliably. I mean, Zivana can clear a unit really well, just from its destroy effect, right? While also placing a decently sized body on the board. But also when you play a freeze deck, things like Frost Hexers, Icicle Burst, or if you're feeling more adventurous, you can even be playing Midwinter. Now,
Ooh.
yeah, and sometimes I do that because it is really good with Savannah and really good with Icicle. Like it's just really nice for freeze. Definitely, Icicle Burst and Frost Hexers are the top freeze cards, and
Mhm.
that those two are really the only ones you need. But sometimes you want to be a bit more feisty, a bit more fun. And what's nice with these freeze cards is that they have the silence mechanic now. It's so good when I can like silence finite loopers or silence azure hatchers or anything like that. It's so amazing for like the control playstyle, and that's why these like Savannah freeze decks still are really competitive and fit in the winter pack control archetype that we have in the BS meta report.
So I'll just take a moment to mention this because
Oh wait, okay, wait, sorry.
go, go right
I
ahead.
guess I guess I forget to mention the key the differences that make like these freeze decks different in terms of like momentum compared to the Aaron Gifted the Wise. And so unlike Aaron Gifted the Wise, where with Gifted the Wise you have this massive like swing turn, mana 7, because you can play Aaron and Gifted the Wise, and all you have to do is survive until then, and then it's pretty smooth sailing after that. It's definitely not the case with a freeze deck without Gifted the Wise. You can definitely use Gifted the Wise if you really want to, but freeze decks like this one, they tend to be more well, I guess you can choose either being like tempo or value oriented, so you can be more mid range or board clear. Like a really nice card to pair in the freeze decks that isn't very common in the Aaron Gifted the Wise decks is Mistwives. Mistwives is the perfect 4 mana to use whenever you trigger Zavana, because Zavana gives 4 mana back. You get a free Mistwives. Not only that, Zavana is a large body. Mistwives like all the time triggers off Zavana. It's a
No, that's
really
really smart.
nice synergy for that.
Yeah, it doesn't move either, so it's not going to hurt itself on play.
You also find a lot more cheaper units in these freeze decks because you don't have such a massive swing turn at mana 7. Like you can find more gifted recruits, Rhymelings, or Westwind, or even like Hunter's Vengeance, right? Because you're gonna need to have those kind of cards to like survive the early game. But eventually, like the kind of Zivana value you get and the synergies you have, like with me, I love to use Ubis, Mistwives, sometimes even Edric. Edric's another amazing 4 mana card to pair with Zavanna. Those cards really synergize well. Mistwives I already mentioned, but with Ubis, like when you place down Zavanna, Zavanna straight up contributes 2 unit types, and that's Dragon and Hero, which
That's so
synergizes
good.
very well with Ubis. And Ubis also being a decently large body, it makes it a bit of a nuisance for the enemy to clear. And when they're busy clearing those, like you're just getting more and more value with your other units. It's really really fun. Definitely a different kind of playstyle than Aaron Gift of the Wise.
Well, yeah, well, a lot of that deck that you're describing is actually more of a mid-range winter, right? Like the mana curve is more aggressive. There's fewer controlling cards in it. It's
Yeah,
much more like not for nothing. Mistwives is a tempo play.
You can definitely build it with a mid-range bent, or
hmm
the version that I lost to twice today, which was more control-y with
yeah,
more freeze effects, with Midwinter, with a Moment's Peace,
yeah.
and with Ulf for life gain. So you can take it in different directions. But I want to point that out, that is a limitation of our meta report, right? Like we lump both of those freeze control or Aaron Gift of the Wise control decks together, because we don't really have a good way to separate them and still keep it convenient
Well, I
for the
mean,
people that are contributing.
you can still say that. I mean, especially me when I was submitting my reports, when I was contributing to the Winter Pact mid range, I am also talking about the freeze variants, because you can use the deck differently. Like the ones I was talking about just now, yeah, they sound more mid range. But like another version that I've been playing recently, I have like Execution, very good nowadays, especially in the top level because of like
Okay,
Pillars of
okay,
Doom or True
sure.
Shot. I also run, well, Void Surgers, but you can use that all the time. I even run things like Crazy Bombers, like those are definitely more control cards, less
Right.
mid range, but like you can still use them. And this type of like freeze deck can fit these two different Winter Pact archetypes, so it's really nice for that.
And there is definitely some blurring of the lines there. It's tough to put things neatly into buckets for sure.
hmm
But we do our best and we hope that it helps people out.
Yeah, I mean, you probably could find a Shadowfen Rush and a Shadowfen mid-range deck that are 10 of 12 cards identical, right? One has Butchers and one has Bragda, kind of a thing.
yeah.
Like
Right.
it's not too far off sometimes, and that's a little bit of a challenge for us when we try to parse it out. But we, like you said, we do our best. I do want to give a quick shout out to Sheepyard. The new freeze effect is phenomenal. I think adding in the silence effect to it has been fantastic for exactly the reason that Arthas talked about 2 episodes ago, which was there is now an actual second winter faction archetype available to people who want to play it. And even better, it runs a whole bunch of Winter Pact cards, which is a little unusual for Winter Pact, or has been over the last several months. The one sort of I don't even want to say it's criticism, because I don't want to be critical of it, but the one thing that's a little unfortunate is that it is such a perfect implementation of silence in the same month they drop Stoic Protectors, right?
Yeah, definitely undercut the Stoic Protectors a little bit.
If they had given Stoic Protectors a month to shine and be the silence effect, and give people time to play with that and figure it out and see if they liked it before making this impact, I think we would have seen a lot of Stoic Protectors. I think Ice Lance is just a better Stoic Protectors. You know what I mean? Like it's just it's a little bit of a shame they both happen simultaneously, because the free stuff is so good.
You said Ice Lance.
Oh,
yeah.
Wrong one
wrong
mana.
game.
Wrong 1 mana Ice Spell.
Yeah.
Wrong game. My fault. All right, so moving on. Our third deck down is Shadowfen mid-range. Does anyone here feel like they know the Shadowfen faction well enough to discuss a Shadowfen deck?
I don't
Actually, I'll
know.
give this one to Arthas so that
Do these
Sabaika can
Shadowfen
talk about
players
Rush.
know how the Shadowfen faction works?
All right, here I will do the primer for these two decks. Okay, so guys, you're going to be running Hags and Helios in both of these,
Okay.
Recruits and Green Protos in both of these. You'll run Rain in both of these. And then Arthas, talk to me about Shadowfen midrange. What's it running that's different?
Mid-range. All right. So, with decks like mid-range that love to put a lot of tempo and like strength on the board, it's really, really nice, especially with Shadowfen and Toad spam, things like Rain of Frogs as their hatchers. It's really good to have cards like Prime Oracle Bragda to buff up all those one strengths. Similarly, you can also have Klaxi or Kindred's Grace, especially with the relatively recent Kindred's Grace buff. It's also really nice for that. At like the 8 mana turn, you can get a Rain of Frogs Kindred's combo, and that's just a lot of strength that the enemy has to deal with. And that's one of like the defining factors for Shadowfen mid range, and that's the buffing up the toads that you spam on the board.
So let's talk about the pros and cons there of Bragda and Klaxi and Kindred's Grace.
Okay, so firstly, Bragda being a legendary, although Klaxi is also a legendary, Klaxi has been in the game much longer than Bragda has. So it's harder to see more common Bragda players because Bragda would like to be a relatively high level, something like 4 or 5, to be worth putting in your deck.
Right. Bragda bumps everything up to the strength that it has, which means that if she survives a trade and she's only 3 health left, it's really not that
Right.
impactful to the game. So you really want her to be as high level as possible in order to make it worthwhile.
And it's not necessarily the case for Klaxi because Klaxi doesn't need to survive a certain amount of strength. It will always set a strength that's pretty high. Like even level 3 Klaxi is pretty scary. Definitely not that scary in Diamond 1, but for the people who are in like Platinum, right, getting to Diamond, level 3 Klaxi is really scary
Oh, it's good.
because
Yeah.
7 strength that already crosses the cheap card threshold of 6 strength. So usually 7 strength units require more than 1 card to clear, and that gives you a lot of momentum. Now with Kindred's Grace, it's a bit harder because they have to be the same unit type, Toads. But I mean, Shadowfen has so many ways of spamming Toads. They have a lot of really good Toads, like Brood Sages, Heliotroopers, and even Chestnuts. Actually, right? Kindred's Grace works really, really well. It's very different because, at least with Brogda, it has movement. It can actually defend if you're in a desperate situation. Kindred's Grace definitely cannot do that.
Yeah, definitely less flexible.
It's less flexible, but it is the cheapest and most accessible card that people can be investing their resources into because it's an epic rarity compared to the
Yeah.
other 2 legendaries.
Yep.
It is a really good investment. It's just a little less flexible than the other 2.
Yeah. Now, Klaxi also doesn't move, but Klaxi can convert your enemy's units also,
Yep.
which is a huge advantage. It's just, it requires a lot more planning or luck or both. Honestly, a lot of times it's both.
Klaxi hurts because I have seen with my own eyes in the in the official Discord a stream where the streamer Klaxied a board of toads and was immediately responded to with by a higher level Klaxi from their opponents,
Oh my gosh.
which is
Yeah,
just like
I've experimented with Klaxi decks, and that has happened to me more times than I care to admit. And that is why I ended up getting away from the mid range and into a rush, honestly, because like I just didn't have the levels to compete.
the one thing I will say for people who want to run Bragda is you can use your hags the turn before to set up your Bragda turn. And what I mean
Oh
by
yeah.
that is throw your hags somewhere where your opponent's going to want to trade into the original body, but you're likely to be able to trade, like you won't lose front and won't be able to attack the remnant because they'll kill the hags, they'll get their little 1 health unit, and then you're guaranteed sort of maximum Bragda value if you can trade into that 1 health unit. And so the best Bragda players I've seen tend to use their hags as the premium turn before Bragda play. I'm going to play this and a couple of other units, and then the next turn I'm going to play Bragda Rain. The other thing I will say is if you're going to play Bragda Rain, obviously play it in the other order, you would think. No. It's actually better to play it Bragda Rain.
Yeah, actually, it actually is.
because rain can sometimes get in the way of your Bragda trade. And so, what's often better is to put Bragda not into the unit that you want to trade in, but just know that when you hit end turn, that unit will trade into Bragda. And so, you play the Bragda first, leaving it just in front of the unit you want to trade with, so that you're guaranteed the optimal placement. Then drop your rain and hit end turn and wait for your opponent to concede. That's the appropriate way to play Bragda. All right, so Sabaiku, now that we've talked a little bit about Shadowfen mid-range, what's different about Rush?
There's a couple different ways that you can build this. How I like to is keeping basically all of the same cards, keeping the Rain, keeping the Azure Hatcher, and instead of Bragda, put in Obsidian Butchers. And yes, you have to play the Rain before you play the Butchers, and sometimes that makes it so you don't have a clean path to the base like you were expecting.
Sad face.
But it's still totally worth it for just the cheapest, biggest runner that you can make. You could also make it a less expensive deck, and instead of Butchers, just go with the combination of Warfront and Lime Limbs and Wild Saber Paws, and just try to push as many runners as frequently as possible into the base. Throw some First Mutineers in there. That is certainly an option. I just really like the combo.
Didn't Daniel create a Shadowfen
David,
Rush
it
deck?
was
David.
David.
It was David.
David.
Yeah,
David G.
that's right.
Oh
David
yeah,
G.
no,
Yeah,
he
yeah,
was
yeah,
like
yeah.
he was pioneering Shadowfen Rush with his extremely low mana
3
curve.
mana and less the entire deck.
Every card, 3 mana or less.
Yeah,
Oh my
and
God.
it was so amazing using First Mutineers and North Sea Dog as a really nice synergy
Right,
because
right.
you can pull that off at 6 mana as like earliest, which isn't even that uncommon. But 7 mana is basically guaranteed if you get both cards in the 7 mana turn to pull off the North Sea effect. And then he also plays things like Faithless Prophets, cheap, really strong body, right? That can put a lot of pressure on the enemy base when left unattended.
Yep. Big
And
fan.
there are
I
some
played that.
really
That was how I made Diamond the first time, was with Faithless Prophets in my deck. It's just
Mhm.
a very underrated card because the negative effect, the downside is significant, but I mean you can push so much damage, and it allows you to punch up into something big and clear it out of the way. Oftentimes it'll leave a 1 health minion that then turns around and becomes your enemy's 1 health minion, which means your butchers will go right through it into the base.
Yeah,
Very
and
true.
there are also a lot of really advanced techniques that you can do with Faithless Prophets and the way that they convert first when they're poisoned before they move forward. So you can even like Toxic a unit near the Faithless Prophets on the enemy base. And that Faithless will actually guarantee move into the enemy base at the start of their turn. And that's actually really nice sometimes, especially when you pair it with Toxic.
Such a bizarre interaction,
Yeah,
but
I
so
know it's
fun.
so cool. It's a bit harder now because Toxic does 6 damage now, unlike the 5 that it did before at max level.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I don't want to level up my Toxac from
No,
level
no,
4.
no, you should. Anyway, there's also the more reliable advanced technique that I want to talk about, and that is not even using Faithless Prophets as the pocketed unit that's going to hit the enemy base. Like, let's say you had Helio Troopers. Helio Troopers is a pretty nice large body for 3 mana, and you also have Faithless Prophets. Let's say you wanted to put both of them in your base. A lot of people might want to put Helio Troopers on the middle columns, and then Faithless Prophets in the corner, next to the Helio Troopers. And, it's not uncommon for someone to be able to do some sort of damage to the Faithless Prophets, even if the Helio Trooper is in the way, and just completely convert your like pocket card there. What you could do instead is actually flip the positions around. Helio Troopers in the corner, Faithless Prophets in the middle. And what's so nice about that is that they cannot ignore the Faithless Prophets because of how powerful, how like strong it is. They need to put damage into it, and when they do, even if they convert it, right? Now they have an enemy unit there that is protecting your Hilo Troopers better than any of your friendly units can. And that I find more success in doing something like that, using the Faithless Prophets as some sort of gate or protector rather than a high risk pocket card.
Yeah, I totally agree. The combination that I really liked doing like that, Arthas, was I played Faithless Prophets and Azure Hatcher. And so what I would often do is use my Faithless to protect 1 or 2 units, like you just said. And when my opponent put their weakest minion into my Faithless to convert it, just because they're like, well, I don't want to expend more damage than I need to here, I'll just put my recruits into it, right? So now there's like a 3 health Faithless left over that's now my opponent's. Well, on the beginning of my next turn, I just put my Azure Hatcher back into it. Always 1 health. So it reconverts it back and then just spams Toad everywhere. And I've base locked. It was just, it was the first time I did it. It was such a cool 2-turn like interaction of guaranteeing, units on their base. And when I base locked the second turn, I'm like, oh, this is one deserves the other. If you're going to play with Faithless, play with at least Azure, but maybe even
And
Hysteria.
you don't even need to play Azure after it got converted. You can play it before so that there is a 1 Toad right behind your Faithless. So at the start of your turn, it auto converts.
Yeah, it's so good.
It's really cool.
So hopefully this gives you an idea of the differences between a rush deck and a mid-range deck, right? So the Shadowfen rush and mid-range decks both have similar cores to them, but their play style is slightly different in that Shadowfen Rush includes several runners like Lime Limbs and, more importantly, Butchers, trying to hit you in the face early, hard, and often, whereas Shadowfen Midrange is looking to try to prioritize those same sort of Toad spam cards in a way to beat control by, similar to what Ironclad Midrange does with a Tower and Fort Tonic, Shadowfen Midrange is trying to do with Toad spam and some giant buff that just takes it all away from an AoE. But aside from that, the 2 decks are fairly similar because they come from the same faction. All right, guys, with that, we'll call that good enough for today. That gives you an idea of the top 2 tier 1 decks and the top 2 out of tier 2. And hopefully it gives you some appreciation for understanding what the archetypes tend to look like and what their priorities are. How to read the frequency score and understand what's being played more often, what you're likely to encounter, but also how to cross-reference that data with what we think are the strongest decks in the game. It is not surprising to see that Ironclad Midrange, being what we think is the strongest deck in the game, is also effectively the most commonly played deck in the game. Sure, Fort Tonic has been buffed, and boy, is it a good buff. But it's also not surprising, to what Sabaiku was saying, to see that there's some sort of what we'll call friction in movement, where there are players out there who can't move from the deck they're currently on to the next hottest, greatest thing because of leveling or resource investment or whatever it is. They're sticking with what they know.
Right. And maybe it's just preference. Maybe there's a lot of people out there that just really like playing Swarm Rush. It's a fun play style. I get it.
Maybe
Not trying to
Reckless
knock
just
it.
has Reckless just has like 20 different alts, and all the people who do our survey were playing him again and again and again. It's totally possible.
The point is really on the frequency score to see what are you going to most likely be matched up against, and then to think about what kind of deck can I play that's going to counter this. How can I make sure that I'm going into it where at least I'm favored in most of my matchups as opposed to being unfavored in most of my matchups.
Right. And also, to the point that we tried to make last time, make decisions based on the kind of deck that you're intending on playing, right? So if you're looking at it and saying, I want to be a mid-range deck, for example, but I'm worried about all this Swarm Rush out there, don't put Execution in your deck. Put Void Surgers in your deck, right? You need to deal with multiple units, and they're all pretty small and cheap. Give it that extra level of thought about, well, no matter what, I want some tempo on the board, so I'd like something with a body. And I need to deal damage to lots of things usually, not just one thing. So let's not go with Fel Flares, let's go with Void Surgers. This is true until they nerf Void Surgers, which may happen soon, in which case, never mind, Fel Flares maybe. That ends the main portion of this episode, which means it's time for me to remind you to follow us on Twitter at Brood Sages. And you can always email us at thebroodsages@gmail.com. which brings us to the next thing, guys. We have received some emails and comments this week. We received feedback from Debnath, self-made. He said, quote, "This was one of the most enlightening episodes so far," meaning episode 11. "I even made an Aaron deck that works quite well in mid-gold. Also, the meta report is such a huge, helpful, entertaining piece. Please keep it going." It's Me Shade said, "Great podcast, as always." Sven said, "First of all, just want to thank you for taking the time and effort to put together the podcast. I love the content." But he also asks us, guys, a very important question, and I want to put it out there right now because we will be giving you guys this content. You ask for it, you will get it. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Quote, "I would love to hear about your beer interests. After all, you are the Brood Sages. So why not let us know what you are drinking and why? Fellow beer drinkers want to know. Cheers." Sven, we will get that information to you. I am currently trying to pitch to my two podcast mates an idea of an archetype to beer pairing episode. It's not working out so well for me yet, but I am working on it. All right, and lastly, we received some feedback on Discord. Grateful Toaster said, "Does anyone know of any videos that show that SF, the Shadowfen Rush deck, featured on the BS meta report?" Which, by the way, the fact that it's being referenced as the BS meta report just makes me feel warm inside. I want to see how it's piloted in different situations. Arthas, what do you got?
I'm going to go DM Grateful Toaster right after this episode because the Merc made a video on the Shadowfen Cordia Rush deck that I made. He actually made one, so I would go and DM you and also post it on the Brood Sages channel in case other people are curious. But there is a video that the Merc, a very top player, has played the deck in, so that'd be very nice to watch.
Perfect. See, ask for content, you will receive it. Sven, hold on. The beer's content is coming, okay? And lastly, Pixels said, "I just want to thank this podcast. The advice and tactics mentioned here made a non-rush player with only 14 base health and level 3/4 cards like me reach diamond." And Pixels, I think you give us too much credit. I do want to say congratulations. Making diamond for the first time. It wasn't so long ago that I did that myself, and I've got to say it was one of the most rewarding things in this game, finally getting there. So congrats. I'm happy for you. All right, guys. And with that, that's going to do it for this episode. For Arthas, Sibaiku, and I am Freeloader. We are the Brood Sages, reminding you to stay hydrated.